Hi there, this is Marcy and David Lynn aboard the sailboat Nine of Cups. Over the years, we've replaced most of our port lights. The last to be replaced were the ones on our transom. All three were crazed and two were leaking. The replacement process is not all that difficult, as David will show you in this video.
Let's start by talking about the supplies I use. I can't seem to caulk anything without making a mess, so for cleanup I use isopropyl alcohol and have a small bowl to pour it into. I use a small ink marker to mark the plastic, 220 grit sandpaper. For the caulk, I like Dow 795 silicone adhesive. It bonds to polycarbonate, fiberglass, and metal, but won't damage the polycarbonate like the chemicals in some adhesive sealants. To help with the cleanup, I also like to use a couple dozen small squares that I cut from sheets of paper towels. I'll show you how I use them later. The wind will undoubtedly pick up as soon as I start the project, so to keep them from blowing away I use a small sandwich bag. I'll need some masking tape, a handful of disposable gloves, and the polycarbonate. For 9 of Cups, we use 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter thick plastic. For tools, I use a variable speed jigsaw with a fine tooth blade, a drill with a screwdriver bit, a caulking gun, a box cutter or razor, a metal spatula for removing the old caulk, a pair of scissors, a straight edge for marking the lines on the plastic, and a small trash can with a plastic liner. Okay, time to begin. The first step is the removal of the bezel. The bezels on 9 of Cups are held on with 10 Phillips head screws. I'm doing this over the water, which almost guarantees I'll drop at least one screw overboard, so I make sure I have a few extras. I've taken all the screws out now. Usually it takes a bit of coaxing to get the bezel off, but this one came right off. You can see there's a lot of rust on the back of the bezel, which means there was water leaking underneath it. Next, I use a spatula to clean off the caulk holding the plastic in place. Once the caulk is removed, the spatula also works well for prying off the old Portlight. You can see how crazed this one is. I think it's the original 1986 vintage. The hardest part of the entire job is removing all the remaining caulk. I'll spare you the grumbling and the expletives. This is how it looked after I finished. The old Portlight can be cleaned up and used as a template for the new one. I use a marker to trace the outline. Then I cut out the new Portlight using a jigsaw. I use a slow speed to help prevent the blade from getting too hot and melting the plastic. The next step is to dry fit the new Portlight. I use a little masking tape to hold the polycarbonate in place until the bezel is attached. Doing a dry fit accomplishes 3 things. It ensures that the newly cut plastic fits, it enables me to check that none of the screw holes are stripped out, and it also allows me to mark both sides of the new Portlight so I know how much of the protective plastic to trim off. Once everything is secured in place, I use the marker to trace around the bezel on the outside. Then I move inside and trace around the trim on the interior side. Next, I'm going to mask around the outside of the bezel. A little planning goes a long way here. If I start in one corner and work in one direction with the masking tape, I'll be able to pull it all off in one long, continuous strip, saving a lot of mess later on. I try to leave about 1/4 of an inch or 6mm gap between the masking tape and the bezel. Once I've finished masking around the bezel on the outside, I remove the bezel and the polycarbonate, then mask around the trim on the inside. The next step is to remove the protective film from the polycarbonate in the areas that will be caulked. I use the razor to cut the film along the line I made earlier. I use a straight edge to guide the razor on the straight sections. Once the cuts are made, I remove the protective film around the area to be caulked. I do the same thing on the inside of the polycarbonate as well. I want to leave the rest of the protective film on until after the polycarbonate has been caulked and is in place. The problem is that once it's in place, it's hard to peel the film off without making a mess. What I do is cut one of the corners of the film off, then mask it with tape. I leave the end of the tape doubled over so that it can be easily pulled up. I'm not sure whether it's faster to mask the bezel or to leave the bezel unmasked and have to clean the caulk off later, but my preference is to mask it. This took me about 15 minutes. As before, I work in one direction and leave the end doubled over so it's easy to pull the tape off later. Next, I use 220 grit sandpaper to roughen up the area to be caulked so the adhesive will stick better. Now the fun part. It's time to start caulking. It's a hot day and I only have about 15 to 20 minutes before the caulk starts to film over, so I want to be as efficient as possible. I start by applying a bead of caulk to the wood frame that the polycarbonate will fit against. Then I push the plastic into position. The sealant has enough tack to hold the polycarbonate in place, at least temporarily. Now I want to caulk the areas that the bezel will mate with. I apply one bead to the transom just inside the masked area, a second bead around the edge of the polycarbonate to fill in any gaps there, and a third bead of caulk to the unmasked front surface of the polycarbonate. Next, I reattach the bezel. I start each screw and then slowly tighten each one until the caulk oozes out from underneath the bezel all around. I want to tighten the screws enough to hold the bezel securely in place, but not so tight that all the caulk is squeezed out. Now it's time to remove the excess caulk. I pour a small quantity of alcohol into a plastic container and grab a small handful of paper towel squares that I'd cut earlier. I use a small square of paper towel to remove a short section of the caulk and then drop it into the trash can. It might take a dozen or two paper towels to wipe off all the excess caulk. If the caulk has started to film over, I dip each paper towel into the alcohol to moisten the surface. I also use an alcohol dampened towel to remove any caulk from the screw heads. Now all that's left to be done on the outside is to remove the masking. If I did my job right earlier, it should be quite straightforward to pull the masking tape off without leaving a mess. As each strip of masking is pulled off, I try to keep the gooey part from coming in contact with the transom, bezel, or the polycarbonate. If there's any caulk remaining around the screw heads, it can be removed with an alcohol dampened paper towel. If I prep the film protecting the polycarbonate correctly, this should also be easy to peel off. And now all that's left to be done is to use an alcohol dampened paper towel to touch up any little imperfections. The same process is used inside. I use paper towels to remove the excess caulk, then remove the masking tape, and finally remove the protective film. Now that it's all done, I can give you a before and after view. Here's the finished Portlight next to the one I'll be doing next. In a few days after the caulking is cured, I'll go over all the screws around the bezel to make sure they're all tight.
Thanks for watching. To view more of our travel and how-to videos, visit our blog and website at www.justtalittlefurther.com.